Good morning, fifth grade. Today we're gonna do a reading class. We're gonna read the story "Scout for George Washington." So if you have your books, turn to page 75 with me. If you have your copies, you can follow along in your copies. But let's get started, okay? So "Scout for George Washington" by Ivy Bolton. "Tory, Tory, down with the Tory!" the boys yelled. Crowded against the wall, Tony looked helplessly at the angry boys about him. He was no match for Will Street and his friends. But as they fell upon him, Tony Bradford fought back as hard as he could, trying gamely to defend himself. It was the afternoon before Christmas, and for December, an unusually warm day. The ice on the frozen Delaware River was beginning to soften. Tony's feet slipped in the melting snow and mud of the road. Suddenly, the boys pressed forward, all attacking Tony at once and shoving him away from the wall. Tony could feel himself falling. Just then, a strong hand pulled the attackers away. The rescuer was a tall man in a shabby blue and tan uniform, with a dark cloak hanging from his shoulders. The boy's eyes widened as the man pulled Tony up, for George Washington was a well-known figure. "Cowards!" cried General Washington scornfully. "Tony is a Tory traitor," replied the boy stoutly. "He's a traitor just like his father. They crossed the river to serve the enemy. We don't want his likes around." The general answered sternly, 4-1 is a coward's fight. You are all taller and stronger than this lad. Get you gone and leave him alone." They went. Tony looked up at his protector. Kindly eyes smiled down into his. The boy rubbed a sleeve across his face. "Hurt, lad?" "Nothing to matter," Tony gulped, but to his dismay, the lump in his throat grew bigger and tears began to stream down his face. "If only it were not true that my father is a traitor," he sobbed remorsefully. The general threw his arm across Tony's shoulders. "Your father is Jacob Bradford, the butcher and farmer?" he asked. Tony nodded. "And you believe in freedom for America, but you have to serve the Hessians?" "Yes. Oh, I hate it all." Tony burst out. For a while I lived with my mother's people, and they speak the language of the Hessians. So father makes me go with him because I understand the Hessians better than he can. I wanted to come to you and fight for freedom. Only father. Your father would not let you go, of course. You will need a little more height and weight first, the general said with a smile. Perhaps you are helping more than you know, my lad, for every brave and loyal heart helps. Your first duty is to your father. Stick by him. Do not be quick to judge. Let us walk a bit. It was not of battles, of victory, or of defeat that the general talked as they walked by the frozen Delaware River. It was unknown heroes, men and boys who worked alone at tasks that brought no glory. The walk ended at the Continental's camp, and what a pitiful camp it was. A smoky fire here and there gave a little warmth. In front of their tumble-down huts, shabby soldiers hobbled about with nothing but rags on their half-frozen feet. It was a miserable place, and one that had been in frequent danger. The Hessians had planned to attack it again and again. Tony himself had heard them talking about it, but always their plans went amiss. Suddenly there was a shout, and 2 men came into the camp dragging a prisoner. Tony gave a gasp of terror. The prisoner was his own father. The soldiers saluted their general. "We have caught the Tory spy red-handed," they announced triumphantly. "He was loading his cart with meat for the Hessians at Trenton. Shall we hang him at once?" "We are Americans," General Washington replied sternly. "Americans do not hang people without a fair trial. Besides, Christmas Eve is no time for a trial or a hanging. Release this man." Then, nodding at Tony's father, he added, "Come here. I want to question you." Reluctantly, the soldiers let the prisoner loose and moved away grumbling. General Washington walked over to Jacob Bradford. Tony stood there trembling. But as he watched the 2 men, Tony grew more and more puzzled. The general did not seem angry, and his father was not afraid. They talked a few minutes, and then Jacob Bradford hurried out of the gate. General Washington turned to Tony. "Come with me, boy," he said. He took Tony into his own hut and spoke soothingly to him while he washed the mud from the boy's face. Then, as Tony stammered his thanks, the general said, "Now go after your father, boy." Tony ran off. His father was waiting for him beside a cart filled with meat and sacks of flour and winter vegetables. Surely his father would not go over to Trenton now, Tony thought. It was getting late and the sun was already setting. "You'll have to help me," his father said in his quiet way. "I'll need a hand over at Trenton. Be like, get up." He climbed up to the driver's seat, and Tony scrambled up beside him with a heavy heart. "Stick by your father and do not judge," General Washington had said. Well, he would obey the general's orders, hard though it was. As they crossed the bridge, Tony noticed that there were big, dark cracks in the ice. When they reached the other side, Hessian soldiers ran up to meet them. They were warmly dressed in their green furred cloaks, with furred gloves on their hands. The soldiers shouted with delight when they examined the heavily loaded cart. A holiday, all of the men shouted. No guards needed on Christmas Eve. Did they say no guards? Jacob Bradford asked his son in a whisper. No guards, Tony whispered, puzzling by the question. Why should his father care? Jacob Bradford spoke in a loud voice. These men will ride on into Trenton with me. You may go back, Tony. Then he dropped his voice so that Tony could scarcely hear him. Go to the general and tell him the Hessians are keeping Christmas. Tell him what you have just heard. He gave Tony a little push. Hurry, and may God go with you. Tony's heart was thumping wildly as he jumped down from the cart and hurried back toward the bridge. It was completely dark now. He moved as fast as he could. He was halfway across the bridge when he heard voices in front of him. I tell you, it was Tony on that cart, Will Street was insisting. We will catch him here and beat him up, the good-for-nothing traitor. Then he added jeeringly, there will be no General Washington here to help him this time. Tony stood still, wondering what to do. The message! How could he get the message to the general? There's only one other way, the river. He shook with fear as he remembered the threatening cracks in the ice. It was melting so fast that a break might come any minute without warning. He would surely die if he were to plunge in those icy waters. But the message must be delivered to General Washington. Tony pressed his chattering teeth together and climbed over the railing down to the ice. When he set out to cross the wide stream, slipping, sliding, lurching over the uneven ice, recovering his balance with a despairing gasp, he continued his terrifying crossing. At last, he climbed up the bank. He was almost too tired to stand, but he forced himself to run. The boys might still try to stop him. There was a roar like thunder up the river. The ice was breaking. In 15 minutes, the river would be a mass of jagged blocks of ice. He stumbled into the camp. The guards stared at him, but took him at once to the general. General Washington's tired and discouraged face lightened up as he listened to the message. Our chance, he cried, and ordered the call to arms to be sounded instantly. We'll use the boats, he announced. The Hessians will never expect us to dare such a project through the broken ice. General Washington entered the first boat. Come along, Tony, he said, but mind you keep out of the sight. The general stood in the bow, pushing away jagged blocks of ice with a great pull. Keep out the fight, lad, he reminded Tony again as they landed, but there was no fighting. The surprise was complete. By dawn, Trenton was in the hands of General Washington's army. The church bells rang out of the Christmas, and for the first victory of the Continental Army in many weary months. In the evening, there was a feast for the victors at Trenton, from the plentiful stores laid up there. When all were seated at the feast, one of the officers sprang to his feet. A toast to our great commander, he cried. A toast to the man who has led us and saved us. A toast to General Washington. A storm of cheers answered him. General Washington bowed and smiled. Then he held up his hand for silence. Not to me are the chief thanks due, he said quietly. We have passed through many bad months. We have been in great danger again and again, but we have been saved. Not by miracle or magic have we been saved, but by the help of two people. Jacob Bradford brought his produce here to Trenton and mixed with the Hessians. He knew very little of their language. Tony, his lad, knew more. Bradford brought his warnings to me in spite of threats from his own people, who did not know he was working for me. Tonight his lad crossed the icy river, full of cracks, knowing that the break might come any moment. He smiled at Tony. This boy Tony loved his country enough and was daring enough to risk that terrible crossing. He brought me the message that was enabled us to achieve this victory tonight. General Washington stood tall and straight. A toast, officers and men, to two heroes. A toast to Jacob Bradford and to Tony, his son. Very good. So that's our story. We have a couple of questions there that I want you to answer, so don't forget to answer, okay? And so let me explain something. Hessians were enemy soldiers. And so we have the Continental Army, which is George Washington and his men, and then Hessians. Hessians were the bad guys at that time. And so I want you to look at those questions and answer them, and then you'll be finished with your assignment. Okay? Goodbye, guys.